Once called the crime of the century by New York City's Mayor Michael Bloomberg, a 28-year-old investment banker, Tricia Miley, was out jogging in Central Park in the spring of 1989 when she was brutally raped and beaten and left to die. Her story of survival made front-page news worldwide, and right next to it were the suspects of the case, soon to be known as the Central Park Five. 5 Black and Latino teenagers, aged between 14 and 16, were quickly arrested and named as the criminals who committed this vile act. They were targeted for their race and proximity to the crime and were ultimately innocent. Today, I will be discussing the case and calculated interrogation techniques used that put the boys in this vulnerable position, how this case exposes the bigger issue of wrongful conviction in the U.S. criminal justice system, and the life-changing aftermath of the case for the 5 men involved. Police quickly sprung to action after finding Miley laying in the park, left to die, at around 1:30 in the morning. That night and the following day, 5 teenagers were among those arrested in relation to the crimes in the park that night. The boys, Kevin Richardson, 14, Raymond Santana, 14, Antron McCrae, 15, and 16-year-old Corey Wise, who only went in support of his friend Yusuf Salam, who was also 15, were ultimately convicted of the crimes against Miley, but they never committed them. Research done by Florida International University shows that juveniles are 2 to 3 times more likely to confess to a crime they did not commit. Police use many unethical devices to get the boys to confess, including pitting them against each other in order to save themselves. The boys were told that they were there as witnesses and made to believe if they pinned the crimes on the others, then they would be free to go home. In a 2016 interview with The Guardian, Salam said, "I would hear them, the police, beating up Corey Wise in the next room. They would come and look at me and say, 'You realize you're next?' They sat through hours of unrelenting interrogation filled with deception and intimidation. Interrogation works basically by making the irrational seem rational, by turning the world on its head until all of a sudden it makes sense to you to confess to something you didn't do," explains Nyrider, who advised on Sarah Burns' 2012 documentary, The Central Park Five. It is perfectly legal for police officers to lie during interrogations about the evidence against a suspect. In Yusuf Salam's interrogation, the police admitted they lied to Yusuf when they were questioning him. They told him his fingerprints could be found on the jogging shorts of the victim, and that's perfectly legal in the United States, concludes Nyrider. None of the minors had an adult in the room who knew and understood their rights, so police had free rein, and the boys themselves had no background with the law or the criminal justice system. They had no idea what the police were and weren't allowed to do. Another issue was recording, or lack thereof. The only thing on record during these interrogations were the confessions, not the hours of psychological and physical berating the boys sat through before making their statements. In the end, 4 of the 5 fully confessed to the crime, cementing them to 5 to 13 years of wrongful imprisonment, until the convictions were overturned in 2003 when DNA evidence was found matching the crime to a serial rapist who eventually confessed. This case is not exceptional. Up to 10,000 people are wrongfully convicted in the U.S. every year. It is imperative to understand this pattern so that the Central Park Five is not just a story we hear and move on from. It exposes a much bigger pattern in the U.S. criminal justice system. A study conducted at American University concluded that the 10 most prevalent issues surrounding wrongful conviction are defense practice, disclosing exculpatory evidence, eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, forensic error, police misconduct, systematic failures, tunnel vision, weak prosecution, and evidence, or lack thereof. All of these issues were prominent in the Central Park Five case. They had no access to representation during the interrogation, they were lied to about evidence by police, they were picked off the street purely because of their race and proximity to the crime. Police were violent and unempathetic to the boys. The system quite obviously failed them. They falsely confessed. DNA was not tested or linked to any of the boys. The news sensationalized the case to where the public needed to pin the crime on someone, and the only evidence brought was the false confessions. It is also extremely important to note the relationship of race within wrongful conviction. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, minorities in the U.S. are 7 times more likely to be wrongly convicted of murder, 12 times more likely to be wrongly convicted of a drug charge, and 3.5 times more likely to be innocent of a sexual assault charge than white people. Our justice system was built to target marginalized groups, and there's no better representation than in this case. It happened at the peak of the war on crime and stop and frisk techniques that police were encouraged to use, targeting Black and Latino minorities. From the very beginning, the Central Park Five were all presumed to be criminals, and that rang true throughout the entire case. From the arrests to the interrogations to the trials themselves, these boys were never seen as 5 teenagers. They were seen as 5 Black and Latino rapists. It would be ignorant to assume that race had nothing to do with how the boys were treated. They fit perfectly into the narrative of the time. And this was not an anomaly. It can be closely compared to the cases of the Scottsboro Boys from the 1930s, the Trenton Six from the 1940s, and the Harlem Six from the 1960s. Each of these cases are cases of racial injustice, with groups of juvenile minorities convicted of violent crimes against white victims that were eventually overturned. The Harlem Six from the 1960s especially parallels the case of the Central Park Five. Both cases were highly sensationalized worldwide. The Harlem Six faced the death penalty and life in prison for the death of a white woman, despite the lack of physical evidence. There is a huge stigma around Black and Latino men and boys in relation to violent crimes against white people, especially women. The stereotype of the Black and Latino rapist definitely fuels the fires of these wrongful convictions. Truman Nelson wrote in The Torture of Mothers that whenever a crescendo of racist fear and guilt begins to build in the white community, the outcome is a frenzied hue and cry, brutal arrests, and hysterical trial of multiple black defendants accused of a crime so monstrous that the whole apparatus of the state, backed by a totally terrorized and convinced public opinion, can be brought into a direct onslaught against them. This rings true for both the Central Park Five and the Harlem Six, and for the millions of other Black and Latino men wrongfully accused and convicted in the U.S. Since their time in prison, the Central Park Five have moved on with their lives, although it will always be a cloud that hangs over them. Yusuf Salaam, 14 at the time of conviction, served almost 7 years in a juvenile detention center. He is now a married father and continues to speak his truth. He was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award from President Barack Obama in 2016. Corey Wise, the only one sentenced as an adult at 16, served 12 years in prison. He still resides in New York City and closely works with the Innocence Project to help advocate for other victims of wrongful conviction and imprisonment and criminal justice reform. Kevin Richardson, 14 at the time of being accused, served 5 years for the crime he didn't commit. He too still resides in New York City and works for the Innocence Project to help prevent his situation from becoming a reality for others. Raymond Santana, age 14 at the time of arrest, served 5 years for the crime. He created a clothing line and donated a portion of the proceeds to the Innocence Project. Antron McCrae served 6 years in prison and is now raising his family down south, moving on from his clouded past. After their convictions were fully overturned, they filed a civil suit against New York City, which was settled in 2014 for around $41 million for them to split. The question we're left with is, does any monetary amount make up for years of innocent lives lost and destroyed? Is our system really just if so many marginalized people are left with injustice every day? The answer rings clear. We may have a legal system, but there's rarely justice, especially for those who fit the stereotypes we have created for them. It's quite easy to see and admit now that things went horribly wrong in the spring of 1989, but we shouldn't stop there. An aggressive overhaul of our criminal justice system is greatly needed to aid those who are most vulnerable, such as the Central Park Five. Until mass change is made, marginalized people will continue to be abused by the very system put in place to protect and serve them.